I don't think I've said a word about France since the brutal crackdown on the Yellow Vests, which didn't immediately end that whole episode in French history, but it slowly over time eroded them and, got to the point to where the Yellow Vests are now a thing of the past. But there's been quite a bit going on over there over the last couple of months. First, we have the interesting trend of the French establishment, sort of symbolized by Macron. He is the neoliberal centrist consensus in France. That's his whole persona. He didn't really have his own ideas or personality. He was just, hey, vote for me if you like, if you like the status quo. And even he and his allies are having to come out and distance themselves from the U.S. establishment and make it clear that they're not in with this woke stuff. They're not about that. They don't want to hate their history and all this stuff and tear down statues. Which is interesting that the center feels like they have to do that in France. It shows that there's perhaps still some national, there's a little bit more of a national soul left in France than there is in the United States, which never really had a national soul. It was really the lack of mass communication that allowed the United States to exist as long as it has. Or I should say, it's the lack of communication that has allowed the idea of an American nation. And lack of travel. Most people stay, pretty close to where they were born and don't travel a whole lot. The travel cult, of course, the cosmopolitans, they are the exception to that rule. But generally speaking, people in the United States, when we think of what it means to be an American, we think of, our own personal community. Because the more that we are exposed to people who are not from our general area, who are from different parts of the country and different different regions and such, we realize that we're all very different here in the United States. But over in France, they've consciously worked since the French Revolution to eliminate those, and in ways that I personally find quite unsavory. It's similar what the French did after even going back to the times of Louis XIV and trying to centralize French culture and homogenize it and unify it. It's similar to what the Chinese do now, which of course by the West is labeled genocide. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. They're trying, the Chinese are like the French, they're trying to destroy provincial culture and make the culture of their capitals, of their big cities, the culture of the whole of China. And France already did this a long time ago quite successfully. So perhaps what we're witnessing here with the rejection of the wokeness and stuff, because the reason why people are able to be woke in the United States, it's not because they are hating on their own culture. When you see people genuflect about how bad the founding fathers were or how bad Robert E. Lee was, it's never people who cared about those figures particularly to begin with. Whereas in France, they have a much more of a cohesive national identity throughout the country, so that you can't necessarily get you can't just put up some figure and have everybody condemn them in French history. You don't have as many historic divides to exploit like you do in the United States with the divide between people who identify with the North or the South. It's very easy to bully people who identify with the South. And the same goes with anything to do with racial grievances, because there has a long history of white people in America interacting with non-white people. It's very easy for the wokesters to turn every historical figure into someone who is racially problematic. And American culture tends to be, in terms of the vast majority of individuals, they tend to be indifferent. The people, you don't really have a majority of the country who cares about any one figure or any one event in American history. So if you're able to get everyone who's indifferent sort of to go along with, if the majority is either indifferent or or wanting to tear something down in American culture, the side that wants to tear it down is going to win, because the people who want to defend any one pillar of American culture, whether it be Columbus, Robert E. Lee, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or even ideas, abstract ideas, it's always going to be some minority who are the ones who are very vocal and strongly in favor of preserving it. Because American culture is very much a patchwork quilt. Everyone has these little their little pet issues that they like to emphasize, that to them is what it truly means to be an American. And I think you have less of that in France. I think that these two letters that were put out by the retired and some, I guess, current French military officers, I believe ranking as high as generals and probably admirals. I don't know. Actually, does France still have a navy? I would think they do. They have a coastline. But anyway, these letters, which unfortunately there's not an official translation out there, you can just kind of use Google Translate. But generally speaking, these officers were warning that if multiculturalism is not reined in and the French homogeneity is not preserved, then it is going to eventually lead to a breakdown in civil society, which I don't know if they use these exact words, but it was interpreted by people that they were warning of a civil war, which you don't have to use that term if you don't want to, because a civil war is a very specific kind of thing. I wouldn't necessarily use that term, but a breakdown in the civil society is correct. And the fact that there are a significant number of French military officers, i.e. people who were a part of the state, who have enough common sense to understand this and to see this coming, to me is quite remarkable, because I look at it from an American standpoint, and you could never get this many military officers to do the same thing here. I mean, heck, we had similar events here in the U.S. We've had 2 letters put out by a bunch of retired military and government personnel, both condemning Trump and Biden, but neither of them were talking about anything that really mattered. I mean, you had the anti-Trump letter that came out here, signed by a bunch of military guys and former spooks and bureaucrats. And what were they mad about? They said, "Oh, well, Trump's not imperialist enough. He's going to lose our great strength in the world. We're going to be weakened because of Trump." I mean, these guys who oversaw the greatest decline and erosion of American power and influence in our history over the past, in the post-Cold War era. These folks who have run our reputation into the ground, who have completely spent all of America's sort of international political capital on stupid crap like Iraq, these guys think that Trump is the real threat to our global power. And now that Biden's in, you've got a bunch of military guys on the other side coming out and saying, "Oh my gosh, Biden, he's such a serious threat to this country. Why is he a threat to America?" Well, it's a little different than what the military guys said about Trump. Now we have a bunch of military guys saying that Joe Biden, of all people, is promoting Marxism. Like, that to them, that's the big issue. If you boiled it down, what's our big problem here? What's Biden's problem? What's America's problem? What are we facing? What's the defining issue of our time? It's Marxism. I mean, I'm no fan of Marxism. I think Marxists are dumb. I think that there's been a lot of good takedowns of Karl Marx's writings. I mean, heck, Eugen von Bauwerk back in the 1880s pretty much put the final nail in the coffin of Marxism, intellectually speaking. And so, frankly, I have trouble feeling threatened by Marxism itself, especially after they had a century of controlling a good chunk of the planet, during the Cold War, from the entire reign of the Soviet Union from, around 1920-ish until 1991. I think that Marx's ideas have been pretty well put to bed. And so, to the extent that perhaps, sure, there's a Marxist element to our problems, because I mean, Marx and evil are just kind of synonymous. Marx was evil, and evil people tend to be Marxists in a certain sense, if you can always paint them that way. But this is sort of a correlation and not a causation thing. Marxism, in some form or another, always comes along when you're dealing with evil people trying to take over your country. But Marxism is not the sort of the core at what's rotting us. The big problem that we have both in France and the United States is a breakdown in civil society, and I think that France and the United States are different places, so there are there's different ways to address these problems. In the United States, I think that we've always been a very disunited society, and that the problem is that the centralization of power, of political power in Washington, is aggravating our differences here in the United States, our differences which exist naturally, which have existed since the founding of the United States. Whereas in France, they've been a highly centralized state for a very long time, and their society is becoming fractured and is beginning to splinter because of the influence of multiculturalism, which is something that has not existed in France since the completion, really, of the French Revolution. And by completion of the French Revolution, I mean in sort of an ideological and a moral sense, when they really controlled the national psyche. Since then, France has been fairly cohesive and unified by the standards of most other countries. But to the extent that there is such a thing as multiculturalism in France, it is going to destabilize that political system. I've talked about before, it's been a long time, but there must be, in order for a socio-political system, in order for a society and a government to be stable, there must be a certain symmetry between the structure of the government and the structure of society. The political hierarchy must reflect the natural social hierarchy. And to the extent that a society is unified and egalitarian and one people who can all live by the same rules, who have the same values, who share a common history, then you can have a centralized regime with common laws that apply to everyone equally. But when you have parallel societies, when you have people with different histories, with different values, with different morals, with different cultures, they cannot share one centralized regime because they have differing interests. They have different ways that they want to run their society, and they are going to have to, live by different rules. And that's why these French military officers are correct in warning about what's going on in France. And I don't know how bad it is because I've not been to France, so I can only take their word for it. I cannot make a personal judgment. I don't even know what percentage of the population Muslims are these days. But in principle, if you have parallel regimes, or I'm sorry, not parallel regimes, if you have parallel societies, a centralized regime will eventually break down, and the result will be some kind of civil conflict. Because naturally, the tendency is for two separate parallel societies, they're going to move towards two separate parallel regimes. I mean, heck, that's why the Israelis always threw out that carrot of the two-state solution in front of the Palestinians, because everyone understands that the Israeli society, the society of the Jews in Palestine, is a different one than the society of the Arabs. They are different peoples with different understandings of history, different cultures, different moral traditions and such, and so therefore they would not be able to coexist under one regime. I mean, heck, you're seeing it now. Really, right now, Israel is a single state, and I don't want to get into talking about Israel, but things are not going well over there, obviously. No matter which side you're on, I think you can acknowledge that the way things are right now, it's not going well for anybody. And what you're seeing in Israel can happen anywhere where you have parallel societies having to share a common regime. And so obviously, these former French military guys and some active duty French military guys, they want to preserve the security of the state that they serve. They do not want to see the power of the state undermined, and they understand that in order for the state to be at peak health, it needs a homogeneous and centralized society that reflects its own structure. Because it was even before, as I said earlier, even before the French Revolution, France was a very varied country that had different local regional cultures and dialects and traditions, and the regime, starting even back, sort of, I guess, royal absolutism was probably the start of centralization in France. But this accelerated heavily after the French Revolution. The state worked tirelessly to mold society to reflect the structure of the state in order to stabilize the state. And so that, to me, seems to be what these military guys are advocating here. Now, Macron is saying how he's going to punish them for speaking out, and, my gosh, this is so terrible. How could they say such a thing about me? But, using French history as precedent, what they're saying, it just seems like common sense. Now, again, I'm not a fan of the French state, so if I lived in France, would I be advocating this? Probably not. Doesn't suit my ideological ends. Although that's not to say that I disavow their letters or some stupid crap like that. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff in there that they talk about that's perfectly, acceptable and things I would support. But the overall mission of trying to prop up the state and perpetuate the regime in Paris is something I have no interest in. But the fact that French people seem to understand this so much better than Americans about how fragile political stability is, and maybe I'm overestimating by saying the French people, but at least these guys in the military here, clearly, I think I've demonstrated why they seem to have a much better political instincts and much more common sense than the former military guys who condemned either Trump or Biden, whether either the guys on the left or the right. They both seem pretty clueless about what's going on in the United States. But from an outsider's perspective, when I see letters like this, and I see that this is a part of the French political conversation, that there are people talking about things that are actually grounded in reality, which is not something I'm used to coming from American politics. Our politics is always, stupidity, things that don't matter, like, Liz Cheney or whatever else that CNN wants to talk about on any given. But seeing that the conversation is a bit more serious in France makes me think that, someone like Le Pen might actually have a chance. And I'm not predicting that she'll win or anything like that, but I'm just saying that I feel like her odds this time around are better than they were last time. And frankly, I believe she did much better in 2017 than she did the time that she ran prior to that. So again, I still wouldn't go to say that she wins, but it seems like people who think like her, who are thinking in this sense that, hey, France is facing an existential crisis, and it's not because of secret Marxism. It's because of very real, intangible political problems that will affect the stability of their government, which, Le Pen and her fans are they're fans of the French Republic, it would seem, and the centralized state. But again, so too are members of the French establishment and the people who support them. I don't think that French establishmentarians want to see their government destroyed or want to see their society destroyed. I think that the French liberals are not as are not quite to the point of being suicidal like the United States' liberals. I think that they truly think of themselves as just doing good for other people without necessarily harming themselves, because of course you have to put on your own face mask first. When the plane is descending. That old analogy. A parent's instinct is, oh well, I got to get the mask on my child's face first so they can breathe. But if you try and do that, you might suffocate, and then you're completely unable to help your child, and then you both die. Whereas if you put your mask on first, then you can quickly, once you have your air supply, put the mask on your child, and then there they go. And the best kind of liberals, the real good-hearted ones, who are just bleeding-heart individuals, they don't realize that they are making a mistake by trying to put the mask on their child's face first. They don't realize that they are undermining the stability of their own country and destroying the peace and prosperity that they enjoy by welcoming in so many refugees who are unwilling and or unable to assimilate into French society. And so as this conversation picks up in France and people continue to talk about this, even some of your good-hearted liberal types might start to wake up and say, you know what, maybe we've gone too far this time. And I think that's what you see with Macron rejecting American wokeism. I think that instead of having such a strong left-right tribe in France, I do think that there is still somewhat of an idea of common French interests. So, with that said, I think I'll leave it there for today.